Welcome to week 4, everybody. This is an exciting week because we are finally moving. We've kind of wrapping up our preliminary stuff, and we are moving into our actual essay modes that we're focusing on for the rest of the course. Remember, this course consists of writing 5 different essays, and our first mode starts this week. If you notice our title, it's narrative writing, which I'm very excited about. It's my absolute favorite. And in reality, it's really the one I think we use not just in academia, but throughout our lives every single day. How we connect with each other is by telling stories, right? What did we do today? What did we have for breakfast? What is our background? What are our goals? All these different things are our own personal narratives. And this week starts that process of us getting to share our narratives with each other and with an audience. And I'm very excited about that. To start, let's go ahead and look at our agenda for the week. We're going to start off by reading our narrative essays section in our textbook. And all you have to do is click on the link. Remember that these page numbers are for what's at the top of the page in the textbook, not for what's listed as the PDF pages, because it includes things like the cover and the title page. So those numbers are different. And you'll learn and read a little bit about narratives and how we can create them and what our purposes are. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that now. If we look, rhetorical modes really are just ways in which one communicates. And narration is the first one we're going to talk about. And it's really, if you think about any kind of more historical text you've read, it is the oldest. William Zinsser points this out. That narrative is the oldest and most compelling method of holding someone's attention. Everyone wants to be told a story. If you look at any ancient religious text, whether that be the Hebrew or Christian Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, anything from all these cultures, the original stories original sections consist of narratives, right? A god or gods did this, these people did this. It's not rules and laws and all these other things, but just stories. We think of ancient things like in ancient Greece, like the Odyssey, the Iliad. In ancient Mesopotamia, we have the Epic of Gilgamesh. All of these things are just stories. And one of my favorite quotes is from an author we're going to read this week, Joan Didion. She says that we tell ourselves stories in order to live. Narration is the storytelling mode of writing. The minute you say to someone, and we do this all the time, right? You won't believe what happened to me this morning. You've just launched into a narrative. To understand how it works, let's look at the story of a young man's arrival after an arduous journey into the city of Philadelphia. I walked up the street, gazing about till near the market house. I met a boy with bread. I had made many a meal on bread, and inquiring where he got it, I went immediately to the baker's he directed me to in 2nd Street and asked for biscuit, intending such as we had in Boston. But they, it seems, were not made in Philadelphia. Then I asked for a 3-penny loaf and was told that they had none such. So not considering or knowing the difference of money and the greater cheapness nor the names of his bread, I bade him give me 3-penny worth of any sort. He gave me, accordingly, 3 great puffy rolls. I was surprised at the quantity, but took it, and having no room in my pockets, walked off with a roll under each arm and eating the other. Thus I went up Market Street as far as 4th Street, passing by the door of Mr. Reed, my future wife's father, when she, standing at the door, saw me and thought I made, as I certainly did, a most awkward, ridiculous appearance. Then I turned and went down Chestnut Street and part of Walnut Street, eating my roll all the way, and coming round, found myself again at Market Street Wharf, near the boat I came in, to which I went for a draught of the river water, and being filled with one of my roles, gave the other two to a woman and her child that came down the river in the boat with us and were waiting to go farther. This is from Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. And not to criticize Mr. Franklin, but there may be some things I would edit in this, like make it a little shorter. He does kind of ramble. And if you noticed, some things are marked as misspelled. Back in the 17th century, in 18th century, when he wrote this, English did not have set spelling yet. So people kind of just phonetically spell things. So like where he has this abbreviation for surprised, that doesn't exist today. It's kind of interesting. But we want to ask ourselves, what makes this a narrative? Like all narratives, the story is of his arrival in Philadelphia. It's an account of events, right? It answers the question of what happened to a particular person in a particular place and time. So, to summarize it, it's about Ben Franklin arriving in the city, shopping for bread, eating, gazing, and strolling about, and he sees a young woman and then performs an act of charity. Interestingly, if we look at his narrative voice, of course, he's writing this from several decades later. He now knows that that woman he saw in the doorway is his wife now, like that he grew to be his wife. He didn't know that at the time. So we're seeing this kind of juxtaposition of what happened then and then Ben Franklin's perspective on it decades later as he's writing his autobiography and has made his accomplishments in the founding of the United States. Narratives focus on events, but you don't have to live a life of high adventure or witness extraordinary acts in order to write a compelling narrative, which we're going to see in our work this week in the 3 texts we read and comment on in the discussion board. The events in Franklin's story are all perfectly ordinary. They could have happened to anybody, right? And in fact, like I kind of commented, I would have maybe even trimmed it up because some of it may come across as kind of dull because it is so ordinary. Like, okay, you went and bought bread, you walked around. The interest, even the drama that we enjoy in a well-told story, often comes not so much from the nature of the events themselves, but from how they are presented. And we're going to see that in our narrative, the 3 narratives we read this week, that they aren't these kind of wild, once-in-a-lifetime events. They're everyday events, but it's how the narrator both conveys them and what their purpose is, what their message is behind just telling this story. Why do we write narratives? Everybody likes a good story, and we tell them for many reasons: to connect with other people, to entertain, to record what happened, like we see with Ben Franklin's autobiography, to explain the significance of events, to persuade others to act in a certain way. So, for instance, if we do like a cautionary tale, right? Like if we say we're telling a story about what happened to us as a way of telling our friends or our children, whomever, don't make the same mistakes I did. Or you can write a narrative to accept our point of what an individual, the writer's, the narrator's point of view on an issue. Ben Franklin, for example, is telling this story at the beginning of his autobiography in order to capture the reader's attention right off the bat and to set the scene for the rest of his life story. If we know anything about Ben Franklin, all of his big events occurred in Philadelphia. So it's his arrival there from Boston. The great point in his entire autobiography is to show readers how he succeeded in life. And so he begins with this like very humble beginning that contrasts with what he becomes. So in a way, throughout his autobiography, but by deliberately including this introduction, he's saying, you may in your mind compare such unlikely beginnings with the figure I have since made. Why do we write them? Although a good story can be an end in itself, like I love hearing good stories, right? People listen to podcasts, they do all these things. Our discourse in this course focuses on narratives that are written to make a point or support an argument because, as I briefly mentioned in week 1, everything is an argument. Everything is, whether it's just writing a grocery list or just having a conversation, is an argument in the sense that it's to convince an audience to either feel a certain way or do something. Such a narrative can be a brief part of a longer work, or it can be used to structure an entire essay, such as we're doing in this part of the course. An example: So suppose you're a geneticist and you're writing about mitochondrial DNA and how it can be used to study human evolution. Uh, for those who don't know, myself included, mitochondrial DNA is passed down unaltered from generation to generation on the mother's side. So you inherit it from your mother. Suppose further that you've isolated 7 strains of a mitochondrial DNA and traced them back to 7 prehistoric female ancestors of all persons presently alive. How would you convey your exciting conclusions to a general audience? And that's something important to think about, that when we're writing, we do want to consider who our audience is. So in this case, if this geneticist who's discovered this, what they're going to say and how they're saying it is going to be very different if they're writing to a general audience versus if they're writing to fellow geneticists, fellow scientists. Brian Sykes, a professor of genetics at the Institute of Molecular Medicine at Oxford University in England, had to solve this problem because his research team had done this. They've isolated 7 separate lines of human descent. He decided to convey the findings by recreating the story of each of these quote unquote 7 daughters of Eve, aka he making this up, providing a frame narrative, whose DNA can be identified by modern research methods. Here's how he concludes this narrative about one of them, a woman who lived 45,000 years ago. So he's kind of made this up. Ursula had no idea, of course, that both her daughters would give rise through their children and grandchildren to a continuous maternal line stretching to the present day. She had no idea she was to become the clan mother, the only woman of that time who could make that claim. Every single member of her clan can trace a distinct and unbroken line back to Ursula. Her clan were the first modern humans successfully to colonize Europe. Within a comparatively short space of time, they had spread across the whole continent, edging the Neanderthals into extinction. Today, about 11% of modern Europeans are the direct maternal descendants of Ursula. They come from all parts of Europe, but the clan is particularly well represented in Western Britain and Scandinavia. Sykes' story about Ursula efficiently explains a number of complicated points about genetics and human descent. He does this all through an anecdote, which is a story, a narrative. By giving each of the maternal ancestors a story, Sykes makes his findings, for those of us who are not geneticists, myself included, much easier to understand and to remember. Sometimes there's no better way to make a point than by telling a good story, if it really fits the subject you are writing about and doesn't go off on a tangent. That's something important to keep in mind. You don't want to lose your audience. Some things to think about when reading a narrative, which you're going to read 3 of them this week, and we'll talk about that as I'm wrapping up this lecture. Once you have drafted a narrative, it's always a good idea to ask someone else to read it. And of course, you yourself will want to review what you have written from the standpoint of a critical reader. It's very different to look at specifically a narrative that is such a personal story from an outside point of view, to make sure it's clear, right? Because we know what we're talking about. We've experienced it. Our audience most likely has not. So here are some questions to analyze, to keep in mind when analyzing a narrative and when writing your own, potentially. You want to think about your purpose and audience. Does the narrative serve the purpose it is intended to serve? So is it convincing? Is it appropriate for its intended audience? Does it need additional background information or definitions? For instance, if I'm writing about, I grew up in New Orleans, but if I grew up in a very small town that most people do not know about, I may want to describe something about that because my audience probably has no idea what that is. The story itself, does it consist of mainly actions and events? Do they make up a plot? Just like fiction, right? Like if you think of, trying to think of a story, maybe something Shakespearean like Macbeth, right? It follows a very specific plot. Is there a clear beginning, middle, and end? Is every action in the narrative necessary to the plot? And have any essential actions been left out? The point. Does the narrative have a clear point to make? What is it? Is it explicitly stated? If not, should it be? Because remember, sometimes we tell stories just to tell them, but often like I said, everything is an argument. And in this case, the ones we write, we're trying to convince our audience of something, to feel a certain way, to think about something, to develop a certain theme about life. And so we want to make sure that we keep this point in mind. Organization. Is it easy to follow? It's like sequential or not? Are the events presented in chronological order? Are there any unintentional mistakes in chronology or verb tense? So if we're speaking in present tense, we want to keep our entire narrative in present tense. Though I have a feeling that most of us may keep it in past tense, but you want to make sure it stays that way. Are intentional deviations from chronology, such as flashbacks, clearly indicated? And you want to think about transitions, which we're going to learn about, which is exciting. We're going to learn about some of those in our grammar lesson this week. Are there clear transitions to help readers follow the sequence of events? And have you checked over each transition to see that it logically connects to the adjoining parts of the narrative? Finally, the dialogue and point of view. If there is no dialogue, remember dialogue is conversation. Would some direct speech help bring to life? If there is dialogue, does it sound like real people talking? That's often a problem some people come into when writing dialogue, that it sounds very stilted. You want it to resemble actually how people talk, particularly in these kind of personal narratives we're writing, where they're from our own experiences. And so we want them to sound like ourselves or the people we know, whether that be accents or incorrect grammar or whatever that may be. You want it to sound like real people speak versus solely academic vocabulary like we reviewed last week. And is the narrative told from a consistent, plausible point of view? This comes into our, we talked about this a little bit with pronouns, but points of view in terms of the pronoun usage. For narratives, I have a feeling most of us are going to use first person, which is I, but you might not and use third person and be an outsider, like he did this, she did that. The details. Does the narrative include lots of concrete details? This is important, right? Especially visual and auditory ones, so visual and sound. Because remember, your audience was not there. You want to make it feel as if they are. You want it to show what it's like versus just telling. The beginning. Will the beginning of the narrative get the reader's attention? How? How well does it set up what it follows? And how else might it begin if you wanted to do something different? Same thing with the ending. How satisfying is it? What does it leave the reader, or what are you intending to leave the reader thinking or feeling? And how else might the narrative end? Those are some things. I have posted this because these are some things you probably are going to want to keep in mind as you're reading the 3 narratives this week. And if we look at them, and it may seem, if you look at your agenda, like, oh my gosh, Mr. Template, there's so much on here. There's a reason behind it. Because we are introducing narratives, it's important to think about them and to read some as a springboard for writing our own. But if you also notice, each one is very short. None of them are, I think, are over 5 pages. They're all very, very short. And our questions for the discussion boards for each one are directly about them. And so let's look very quickly at our prompts. If you remember, your first essay is not due this week, but it's due in 2 weeks. But I want you to begin working on it, so you're not rushing to write it on its due date, September 18th. So if we look at our, where is it? Oh, our prompt. We have 4 potential options. Remember, when you are when this, and I'll review this again next week, you're selecting one of the prompts. Your essay must be at least 5 paragraphs. It can absolutely be over. And I suggest brainstorming some different narratives you might want to write about, thinking about things that you've experienced or whatnot. You may want to consider your purpose as you're developing these, like what are you trying to say? And after all, like the authors we read this week, your narrative should do more than just tell a good story. It's to make a point. Although with a narrative, you want to tell a good story, right? So our first prompt, like Joan Didion's on Going Home, write an essay-length memoir of going home. Describe the place, and this will make more sense once you read the narratives this week. Describe the place and people in detail, tell what they typically do and say, and link your recollection to your present life, perhaps showing how it is different now from what it was. Our second one refers to another essay we are reading this week. Using Amy Tan's Fish Cheeks as a model, write a narrative about a time when you felt different from others. Try to imitate the way it integrates the external events. So the event that is actually centered around when she makes this discovery with her own feelings about what is going on. And our third prompt also references a narrative we're reading this week. Just as Sherman Alexie does in Indian Education, write a narrative about a particularly memorable or significant aspect of your life as a student, whether that event is positive or negative, or a mix of both. You can focus on a single event, a series of events over the years, or on your entire academic schooling career. As you relate your story, try to give your personal experience meaning for your audience. And our final prompt, if none of these interest you or you find them baffling or whatnot, or not, it's entirely relevant, you can write a topic on a narrative on a topic of your choosing. And I have listed some potential brainstorming ideas below. You are by no means tied to just those. They're just ways in case the other three do not interest you. Again, that is not due this week. However, it is our last thing. You want to begin writing that because it is going to be due soon on September 18th. And you don't want to get stuck in the position of trying to write the entire thing the day it's due. And that brings me to one final point, and I'm going to send out an email to everybody about just a general catch-up email. You may want to develop a schedule for getting your work done. I'm noticing a lot of people are getting most of their work done on Sunday, which is fine. I just don't want you to feel rushed or to just be doing everything on Sunday, because you're going to overwhelm yourself, particularly now that we're actually getting into full essay writing. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Have a great week, everyone.